So now we have a silicone mould, either one you've made yourself or commercially bought. It's time to mix up some resin and do a casting. So this is a type of open cast, which means that the top of the mould is going to be exposed because that area doesn't need to be detailed. When you were doing sort of a more complicated, you would do a closed cast, but that's not what this is. You're going to need to pick up your 2-part epoxy resins. This is fairly easily available these days on Amazon or other places. And it comes with the hardener and the resin itself, and you're going to want to mix these in equal quantities. Try to make the amount you need for the mould and a little bit more. And if you do have any excess, have some spare moulds just to pour the excess into, so you're not wasting anything. I measure by weight in an old coffee cup. This one's been used a few times, that's okay. So I reckon I'm going to need about 40 grams of each to do this job. I'm just going to keep an eye on that. There we go, 19. Perfect. So I'll put exactly the same amount of the hardener in now. There we go, perfect. This does have a fairly long working time, so I'll just put that to one side for a second and get rid of our scales. I always try to do all my resin work with a little board to protect my working surfaces. So that's our 2 parts in there. They're not mixed together yet. As a little aid, add in a few drops of contrast paint. Don't use normal acrylic paint, it doesn't react very well. It will separate. For whatever reason, the chemical composition of contrast paints means it will mix in really well with 2-part epoxy resin. You'll need to stir it for about 5 minutes, not vigorously, because what we don't want to do is add in lots of air bubbles, because then we've got to try and remove them. This whole process we're going to try and do without any sort of mechanical aids. I spent 5 minutes mixing it all together. The contrast paint, you can see there's a nice uniform appearance. That means everything is thoroughly mixed. You may observe there are plenty of air bubbles in there. There is no way you can avoid this really. Well, that's a massive one right there. Try and manually pop them if you can. But if you have one, get a massage gun, or you can just use a tapping method and get as many of those air bubbles to the surface as you can. After you've done that for a few minutes, you may observe most of the air bubbles have come to the surface. And what I like to do is use a long neck lighter and just wave a little bit of heat over the top. This is slightly dangerous in that resin can catch fire, but it has quite a high flash point. So what I do is I just waft it over the top. I don't hold it in one place, and that should stop it all catching fire. But clearly, this is dangerous. Well, there's an element of risk you should be aware of. We have gotten rid of as many bubbles as we can. Let's get our mould in place. I'm going to pour it over. Again, we're going to try and avoid adding any more bubbles in. That will probably do. That's probably too much as it is. And the idea is you don't work the edges, work from the centre outward, and it will eventually spread the resin and cover everything. Remember those 4 skulls? Just force down into there. Make sure the resin has gotten all the way to the bottom. Likewise, the 4 corners. Make sure the resin does travel all the way to the edges. I can still see plenty of bubbles in there, so again, we'll just get the massage gun out. I'm going to try and get them out. Once we've tried to get as many of those bubbles out again, this is an open mould, so we don't actually want too much excess on the top, because then we're going to have to file it smooth. So what I do is afterward is with my mixing stick, I skim over the top, because all of that's no good. That's just more work for future me. Try and capture it and pop it back in. Don't worry, you've made a mess on the top. You can just clear that up. When it cures, you'll be able to crack that off because it's silicone, and silicone doesn't really stick to much. Just get the vibration gun on it again, the massage gun, and that will level it all out nicely. After about 24 hours or so, the resin should have cured. Timings are dependent on sort of heat and humidity, but it should just pop out of the mould, like so. There we have a casting. Compare it to the original. It's fairly accurate, but I'm sure you've noticed there's lots of bubbles in it. This isn't necessarily a problem because the bubbles should have risen to this side of it, and I can actually run my finger over that and feel all those bubbles. What we'll do is we'll tidy this all up. If you take an old emery stick and use its rough side, we're going to file down the edges where the casting will meet the top of the mould. It'll be slightly rough and you'll never get a perfectly smooth finish. You've got this bit that's sticking out here, so we're going to take that down for a start. Remembering what we learned in the video on how to make the original window, you apply finger pressure to the top of the file, or emery stick in this case, and make sure you run your fingertips across the entire length of the portion you're filing. You can now see the filings, the sort of white residue, has gone into the pockets where the bubbles are. It's not great, but it is fixable. Right, so you want to file down all 4 sides now. We've now polished up all 4 of the outside edges. We're going to polish underneath as well. So I'm going to grab some 120 grit sandpaper. 240 will do. This is just a bit coarser and will work faster. And I'm just going to use a figure of 8 motion on the casting to take these bubbles down. So when we paint this and go glue it to our ruined building, it'll adhere nicely. It is very hard to apply even pressure all over it, so instead I'm just going to hold the edges and do the figure of 8 pattern. Where this is cured slightly concave, we're wearing down the edges faster than the middle, although we can still see where the tops of the bubbles have been filed away. But when we secure this to our ruin, what we want to do is make sure this has as flat a surface as we can. So we're going to get the emery stick out again, using the rough side, and just focus down the centre. Now I've taken all the edges off and the bubbles have been ground down, just use an old makeup brush and take off any residual. It's really hard to judge the quality of the casting in this state, so what I need to do is paint it. When we jump back in, I'll have undercoated it and given it a quick dry brush of metal, and we can see if any of these air bubbles have affected the casting. Done a quick and crude paint job there, but this perfectly illustrates everything that might have gone wrong with the casting. You can see all around the edges here of the windows that those are bubbles that go all the way through. If I were to put this light box here and the casting over top of it, you can see how porous it is. That does exaggerate how bad it is, but it's actually not really a problem. As long as you're not going to pour anything into those, you wouldn't really notice. If you remember, I did talk about the eyes having those sort of weird bulbous eyeballs if you don't get the casting correct. I have done another casting and this hasn't been repeated, so this is an issue with this specific casting. But yeah, if you don't get the air bubbles out of the eye sockets, you do get these weird massive eyeballs, which can be quite freaky looking. Some of the rivets haven't cast properly. Again, those are just little air pockets, so I did a pretty poor job on this one. If you do find your windows a little bit out of shape, or any of your castings really, I just held this under a hairdryer for 5 minutes and now it's nice and malleable again. When this cools back down to room temperature, it will go solid. Whilst it's cooling, just lay it on a flat surface, let it regain its shape. But overall, I am actually quite happy. I know the mould will work. I have repeated this one just to make sure, but this is the original casting. I want to show you how badly it could go, and to be honest with you, it's not really that bad. And now you can recreate these windows or whatever you've cast as many times as you like to make some nice, cheap, quick and easy scenery. Well, do give that a go and let me know how it goes.